Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sunday's Other Scriptures for March 3rd. I'm continuing a series on the big questions, and I'm going to be preaching on the epistle reading from First Corinthians under the question, What is wisdom? And our readings this week are all pretty closely tied together and pretty easy to figure out. So I'm just going to run over them quickly. Our first reading is taken from Exodus chapter 20. It is the giving of what we call the Ten Commandments, although in Hebrew it's known as the 10 words. It's referred elsewhere in the Old Testament as the Ten Commandments um, or 10 words. These basically were the basic laws which God was requiring of the Israelites in order to make a covenant with them. And this was a conditional covenant. If you go back earlier in chapter 20, you find out that God is going to favor and choose the Israelites, and they'll be his chosen people on the condition that they worship him and him only, and that he gives them these laws that they would become a greater nation than any other nation on the face of the earth, laws that would reveal the nature of the true God. That's why he had raised them up as a people from Abraham, which was our reading from last week. However, again, it was a conditional covenant. The covenant with Abraham was unconditional, but the covenant with the Israelites was a conditional covenant. They had to, as part of the covenant, obey these rules. And the 10 words that are in this chapter are not the entirety of the law, but they're really a summary. They're the basis of the law. And you'll notice that they start out with the first word, really, as the Hebrews divide it, is I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. The first word is a word of grace. It's not a word of law at all. It's the basis for this relationship, is that God is the one who has rescued them. And then come some other laws or commands, primarily initially dealing with the fact that they're not to have any other gods. And along that, with that, they're not going to abuse his name. They're not going to make images of God, and they're going to one day out of a week, one day out of every 7 days, the seventh day, they are to set aside to worship God and enjoy the things that he gives them. And then the other laws have to do with their relationship with each other. You know, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, shall not go on social media and pass along information that's not true about other people. Okay, that's kind of a modern take on it. But and you shouldn't covet. That is, desire something that belongs to someone else, which would motivate you to go after it and cause all sorts of friction in society. Now, I didn't know until I was in my 20s that there are different ways of numbering the Ten Commandments, because they're not numbered in the original manuscript. And so the Hebrew people start with this first word being a word of grace of God, and then it's easy to come up with the next 9. But there are 2 other systems, depending on whether you were raised Protestant or Roman Catholic, and in which group, that go back to the early church, one of which combines the 2 covenant commandments, but separates out making graven images from having no other gods. The other one combines graven images with the idea of only having one God, but then, and this is the Lutheran way of doing it, we have to separate coveting into 2 different commandments. So none of them are perfect. I myself am, even though I'm Lutheran, kind of like the Jewish way that starts with a word of grace. Anyway, this has to do with wisdom, because this was the wisdom of God that was being revealed to the Israelites. This was a superior system of laws to any other nation. Our second reading, our responsive reading in our psalm, is from King David, and it speaks of God revealing his wisdom and really his glory, first of all, in natural revelation, that is the sun, which is so vital to life, and the heavens are revealing the glory of God. And then in the second half, just as bright as the revelation of the sun, really, is the law of God, the statutes of God. And David recognizes this. And so there's a lot of back and forth about how great God's law is. Not that we can keep it, but it reveals the beauty and the perfection and the grandeur of God. So it's something that we ponder, that we gaze into, just like we can't reach the stars, but we still appreciate them. We can't go close to the sun, but nonetheless, it gives us life. The same is true for the law of God. And then our gospel reading for today is the story from John's gospel of Jesus clearing the temple. This is a little bit different than the one that's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which happens right before Jesus' passion. This one happens early in his ministry. And it's it may be a little bit hard for us at first to understand what Jesus is so upset about. After all, isn't it convenient that that the merchants are selling animals to people that need to travel from all over Israel and beyond to make sacrifices? And it's hard to keep pigeons or doves alive for that trip, so they're just kindly selling to these pilgrims the required sacrifice for the temple, right? Well, no, not actually. There's a couple things wrong with what they're doing. The first is, as Jesus points out, they're turning a house of prayer into a den of robbers. Why robbers? Well, because of course they're charging people way more than the going rate for the convenience of location, location, location. They can get this in the temple. And in fact, there's good evidence that the priests were allowing this because they were getting a kickback from the merchants. And of course, these animals had to be approved for the sacrifice. So you could bring your animal from your own home, but it wouldn't necessarily be approved by the priests, especially if they weren't getting a cut for the sale of this animal. And so they really were ripping people off. The same was true with the money changers. You had to exchange your Roman coin for the temple coin, and they would charge an exorbitant exchange rate that favored them. The other side, though, is in the Old Testament in Isaiah, when it talks about this being a house of prayer, it's a house of prayer for all nations. And if you remember, the structure of the temple was such that the outer court was for the Gentiles, the nations. It was for people that were not Jewish to come and worship the true God. But guess where these merchant booths were set up? They were set up without a doubt in the court of the Gentiles. In other words, they were crowding the Gentiles out. So it's not just that they were distracting from worship, they were actually preventing people from coming and worshiping the true God at his temple. And this is one of those places where Jesus loses his temper. I don't know if I should even say that, but he has really righteous anger for the sake of other people. He doesn't lose his temper. He doesn't have anger on behalf of his being mistreated, but he does get angry when other people are mistreated. In this case, the Gentiles and his fellow Jews who are being ripped off and excluded from the temple. So this is the wisdom of God, right? He lifts up the lowly and he knocks over the tables of those who are considered to be wise in the world because they're taking advantage of a business opportunity. Greed is considered wisdom, especially in our culture. We're a capitalist society, so we really elevate greed as, boy, just the height of wisdom. If you can make lots of money, you must be really smart. But God's wisdom is very different. Which leads us to our last reading, the one I'm going to be preaching on from 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Paul is talking about the fact that God's wisdom is different than worldly wisdom, and the specific instance that he points to is the cross. To this day, it seems absolutely ridiculous to people that God would send his son into human flesh and then allow him to be so abused and to be executed on the cross. He's not a winner in the way that the world defines winners. But in fact, we know how that turned out. We know that God did this for us in order to win us. It was the one way that God's justice could be served, that punishment would be poured out for sin, for failing God. But whereas we could not bear that punishment and God couldn't bear to be separated from us for eternity, he pours it out on his son and then resurrects his son so that we are redeemed by this punishment that's taken in our place. We are guilty, but we're pardoned by Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. He experiences separation from God and hell in our place so that we can experience eternity along with him. And this is the wisdom of God. It was foolishness to the Gentiles and a stumbling block to the Jews. And I'll be talking about that in the sermon, how both of these groups and many people today consider this absolute lunacy. But this is the wisdom of God. Again, very different from our wisdom, very much superior to our wisdom. So I hope that stimulates some conversation for you and some thinking about our texts and how they relate to each other. The Lord bless your study.